Chaturanga is a pose that people have a love or hate relationship with. And the love or hate relationship with Chaturanga depends on a couple of things. One, if you have injuries, if you have injured in your wrists or you have injuries in your shoulders, Chaturanga is not something that feels good or you should be doing. And it's really up to you to just make that decision. I'm going to show a modification for Chaturanga so that you can use that if you have either of those injuries. The other thing is, so it's shoulder strength and it's core strength. And those two things will provide a strong Chaturanga and will help you to be in love with Chaturanga. I don't teach it that often. I don't bring much attention to it when I teach because it is challenging, and it's particularly in this time when I can't see you. It's hard for me to give corrections because it is a really strong pose. It is something that we use in a sun salutation. So you will see it or hear it or feel it or do it whenever you're doing a vinyasa class. So what is Chatu-whaaat? Chatu-whaaat. Chaturanga means four-limbed staff pose. So Chaturanga means four-limbed staff. Chaturanga Dandasana, so Chaturanga means four-limbed, and then staff means four-limbed staff pose. I wish I could get this down pat. Dandasana is that staff pose. So staff meaning spine, and Chaturanga meaning four, meaning you have your hands and your toes on the mat. So Chaturanga Dandasana. Let's warm up a little bit to get into your shoulders. I like to start in down dog, shoulders back and away from your ears, and then just come forward to a plank pose, shoulders over wrists. So back to downward facing dog and back to plank pose. One more time, downward facing dog and plank pose. So this looks like it's a four-limb staff pose, and it is. It's called a high plank, and Chaturanga is more of a low plank. So your elbows are bent, but you're still got everything off the mat except for your hands and your feet. So in Chaturanga, well, let's take it to our hands and knees. This is a great modification if you are doing sun salutations, you have a hard time doing it. It's important to bring the shoulders in front of the wrists. So you notice how I go from hands and knees and I come forward, so my shoulders come in front of my wrists. And then I bend my elbows to a parallel at 90 degrees. You want your shoulders no lower than your elbows. That's where the shoulder pain and injury can come from. So 90-degree angles of those elbows, shoulders in line with those elbows, and you come forward of those wrists. Okay, so that's super duper important. So when you're coming from hands and knees, you'll come forward, bend your elbows, 90-degree angles, shoulders no lower than your elbows. So you want to have them parallel. The other thing you want to remember is to look slightly forward of where you're heading. You don't want to look up because that will crank the back of the neck, and you want to keep parallel with the floor. So coming from hands and knees, bending the elbows. Now, the other important thing is to not let those elbows splay, because then it becomes more of a push-up. And you'll hear people say all the time, let's do a Chaturanga push-up. Great, but keep your elbows in and don't let your shoulders go past them. Okay, so that's fine if you want to do a Chaturanga push-up in your vinyasa. Just make sure you're keeping that pose nice and strong. So from hands and knees, come slightly forward, bend the elbows. Let's do a Chaturanga push-up. Come back up. My elbows are right into the sides of my body. My gaze is just in front of my mat, and I lower down, and I come back up. That's a Chaturanga push-up. That's a great way to get your triceps strong as well as your shoulders. Now, the real pose is you have your knees off the ground. From plank pose, core is nice and strong. Your feet are engaged. You want to stay super engaged through your legs. So squeezing the inner thighs in and slightly lifted. Now tailbone is towards your heels, okay? Not up towards the sky, but towards your heels. I'm going to bring my shoulders forward like I did on hands and knees. Bend the elbows, again, 90 degrees. Shoulders not lower. And then push back up and downward facing dog. So same premise, but a whole lot more strengthening through the core. That's why Chaturanga is good for your shoulder strength and your core strength. Now, if your shoulders do drop down, I wanted to show you this so you see it. your shoulders are going to come forward if they drop down lower. Now that is going to put a lot of pressure on these teeny tiny muscles on the shoulders. You really want to use your back body muscles. So I'm coming from plank pose, shoulders are back and down, elbows are bending. Notice how my shoulders don't come forward. What happens a lot is this. And part of that is because our core is not strong, okay? So make sure you're engaging your core, you're engaging your legs. Plank pose, elbows drawing in, you're coming to your tippy toes, engage those legs, engage the core, tailbone to the heels, gazes forward, bend the elbows, shoulders above those elbows, and come back up. Do it one more time, Chaturanga, then to the belly. Now, Chaturanga is great if you want to go to up dog, because in up dog, your legs and belly and thighs are off the mat. So it's an easy transition. And then you can go back to Chaturanga and back to plank pose. So I'm going to show you from your bellies now. So we've got Chaturanga from our hands and knees, right? Come forward, bend the elbows, come back up. From plank pose, make sure you don't, this is, I can't stand saying this, that will also, how does that look for my Chaturanga? So belly's engaged, Chaturanga, then down to my belly. Now, you're going to come from the floor sometimes to Chaturanga. You'll hear people, teachers, teach it that way. It's very challenging and it's a lot of core strength. So spread the fingers, hands are super important. You're going to push down into the mat, elbows squeeze in, shoulders pull back, gazes forward, tuck your toes under, push in your hands, your toes, lift your belly away from the mat, lift the thighs off the mat, Chaturanga, plank pose, downward facing dog. Okay, let's do one sun salutation with all of that in there. And I have no idea if I'm in here 12 minutes. Okay, you ready? Downward facing dog. Take a big breath in and a big breath out. Walk to the front of your mat. We're literally going through a whole sun salutation. Inhale all the way up. Exhale, fold all the way down. Lift halfway up, breathe in. Step back to plank pose. Now we're going to Chaturanga. So we're going to come to our tippy toes, come forward, bend the elbows right to the sides of the body. Now, flip your feet, roll your shoulders back. Up dog, my legs are off the mat, my shoulders are still back. I'm going to go back to Chaturanga, to plank pose, and downward facing dog. Hope you no longer say Chatu-whaaat, because now it's Chaturanga. 4-limb staff pose. Have a great day. Mwah. Namaste.